Hello, this is Reg Athwal, and welcome to another episode on our channel, Family Business Experts, where I get a chance to interview an expert, someone who's published work, or someone who's an authority in their subject matter, who can leave us with some great ideas and insights and wisdom that can help us at either a family level, a business level, or ideally both. So my guest today is Mike Wittenstein, all the way from the US, Atlanta, Georgia. Welcome, Mike, to the show. And it's only fair that I give you a formal introduction. Viewers, you can see on the screen there some of the credentials for Mike's firm and personally. Some of this is already out of date. He's the founder and managing partner of Storyminers, which he established in 2002 as one of the world's first story and customer experience design firms. Can't wait to find out more about that. They've delivered over 750 engagements now and projects, and the firm really knows how to help leaders get their stories straight. Outside of that, customers are raving about the work that they do. They've done this in 26 countries now, over $2 billion of earned value for their clients in improvement in sales, operations, service design, and brand management. Outside of this, Mike is a consultant. He's certified in this area as a certified speaker, and I love this title, as an experience designer. So on that note, Mike, thank you very much for joining us today out of your busy schedule.
It's a pleasure to be here, and there's nothing to add, Reg. What a great introduction. Thank you.
I really appreciate it. So I'm really curious, Storyminers, okay? What does that mean, and where does this come from?
Well, the real story is that my co-founder, Tom Milkovic, and I were sitting at a Starbucks the year before we started this, 2001. And he came to me and he said, Mike, I'm going to go into the customer experience. I want to like go on the corporate side of things. And I said, Tom, are you sure? And I walked over to the newsstand. So I always have the local newspapers, and I pulled both of them off. I didn't pay for them. I knew I was going to take them back. I brought them over and I dropped them on the table, and they said Delta Airlines to cut 4,000 marketing staff, Coca-Cola cutting 10% of its marketing staff. I said, Tom, there's no way you can go in business and compete against this rush of talent that's coming into the market right now. So he kind of sat back in his chair and he was pretty unhappy about that. So then we talked a little bit more, and to bolster his self-esteem, I talked to him about what he was really good at. Renaissance guy, does so much in so many different areas. He's an artist, a photographer. I said, Tom, what you're really good at is helping people come across the way they really are. And then he complimented me, and it turned into this little, mutual admiration society. And then almost at the same time, we said, oh yeah, we're Storyminers. Right. We help people figure out who they are and why they are and what they exist to do, and make their value propositions clear. So we took that story to 6 different clients, and we sold all 6 of them engagements. So the name stuck.
That's impressive. So let's go deeper into this subject now. Why are stories so important for companies, for maybe owners of businesses to express themselves to maybe their family or their workforce? What is this thing about stories?
Reg, it's because as humans, we're naturally wired for stories. There are no less than a dozen books that have been published just this year, 2020, on story. And a lot of them talk about the roots and the history and the tribal sharing of knowledge and things like that. But ever since we're little kids, we're told, we're taught, and we enjoy hearing about things in stories. Rather than hearing what's the temperature today, we'd rather hear a story about a little rabbit that, starts to enjoy his day in the sun. And what that does is it teaches us to relate a whole bunch of different ideas one to the other. And that's what story does. It creates context for all of us. Stories are also long-lasting time-wise. So you can carry a story's arc from years and years ago into the present and even into the future. So stories help us make sense out of the world around us, what's happened to us in the past, and what's to come. And since families live in a multi-generational world, they're particularly important there.
So can you give us some examples on how we could use stories, and maybe also share with us with your design experience? If someone's watching this right now thinking, I want to get better at maybe sharing stories, or maybe in a written format, I want to become better at writing stories, maybe even publish a book, a story-based book. What could be some of the steps that they should go through, Mike,
Okay.
with your experience?
Reg, if you don't mind, I want to replace your question with a different one. I know that hopefully that's not rude. But what's the best time to use a story? Because first, if you recognize when you can use a story, it becomes a lot easier to do the other things. You don't have to be a great story writer or a good storyteller to leverage stories. So let's start there. Is that okay?
So let's repeat that question. When's the right time to use a story?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there's a question.
All right, thank you for that. I'm glad you asked that. So a really good time to use a story is when you're trying to make, one, a lasting impression on people. Two, when you're trying to teach a lesson. And three, when you're trying to shape what the future might be like. Okay, those are the three. Let's start with the future one first. Many times, a family business or a regular business or a government or an institution is making plans for its future. And unfortunately, the way most of them communicate is in charts and graphs. We've been taught in school to summarize, to document, to numericize. That's not a word, but you know what I mean, to just put numbers to things. Yeah. And we think that tells the whole story. Well, we know from all the stuff happening with COVID that it sure doesn't tell the whole story, because there's human life and suffering at risk. There's the work and effort of lots and lots of different people. And the numbers don't just tell the entire story. So when you're telling a story about the future, about where you want to go, it's very helpful to use that format, because stories provide a grounding of where you came from, and they can also make it easier for someone to understand what the future might be like. Most people don't care about what the future is going to be like, even the futurists. They want to know what's the future going to be like for them, specifically their needs and concerns, their way of seeing the world. But how can one story connect hundreds or possibly thousands of members of a family or people in an audience or team workers in a company with just one version? It's really hard. Well, it is kind of hard, and that's why several versions of the same story can be really helpful. The key to figuring out that story for the future is to use a simple format. Now, this is back to your question of how do you write a good story. It's called the hero's journey. It's a story arc, which pretends the sequence of events and the events that happen to the hero in the story. So typically you have a normal person who befalls some kind of tragedy or difficulty. They build themselves back up with the help of sages and teachers and guides, and then they win over whatever that original challenge was. But the reason they win isn't good versus evil. It's because they've transformed themselves as a person. They've learned, they've grown, they've become capable in more different ways, and they've also changed their perspective about how they see the world.
This is called the hero's story, yeah?
The hero's journey. A pattern discovered by Joseph Campbell. You can also call it the hero's story. And here's the one thing, here's the next question I want you to ask me. What's the most important thing about the hero's journey?
What's the most important thing about the hero's journey?
Reg, you're a natural at this. It's to make sure that the company, the brand, or the product are not the hero. If you're the patriarch or the matriarch of the family, you're not the hero. The person who's coming up through the ranks, the younger member of the family.
Why is that important?
Because if you're the senior person, you've already lived your life, and nobody else can be you. They have to become themselves. Each of us is born a little bit differently. We have different experiences.
What if there's a bit of an ego there, and they also want to feel a bit significant, to be at least part hero?
The wisest approach, and I hope I don't offend anybody, is to step into the role of Yoda and not try to be Luke Skywalker. Try to be Dumbledore and not Harry Potter.
Okay.
You have to find happiness in that, because so many times the strong egos pull everyone along with them, and while that makes them feel good and it does good for the organization because they're uber capable, it doesn't let these other people develop fully as contributors. They don't ever get to become the heroes, and heroes beget more heroes. Right. So as a hero matures, their job is to make more heroes. And you do that by painting pictures, by telling stories that put other people into that role of the person who's becoming, getting better, boom, finally does something amazing. To support those people in going through the difficulties in their own journey is truly the hero's work. That's the most important thing you can do as the leader of a family or one of those who guides them, my opinion.
So can I ask you then, one of the things that comes up often with the work we do with family businesses is when we develop something called a family constitution.
Mm-hmm.
Some people refer to it as a family charter, which essentially captures the philosophy of the family from previous generations, and ideally also getting the stories from the eldest person in the family. It could be a 75-year-old chairman, an 86-year-old grandmother, who's outlived everybody else at this stage, and it's capturing those stories and putting them into what we call the family history section, and capturing the family values and turning them into guiding principles for the future generations. What tips would you give some of our viewers or clients watching this of how story mining could help that part of the process?
Well, I'd probably do two things. And first of all, when you told me about this, Reg, I was floored. I had no idea that you went into that depth with your clients. It's fabulous that you're doing that, especially the guiding principles and all of that. There are two things that I think could make for amazing storytelling for the family business level. The first one is to have a meeting to talk about the stories that need to be told. And that needs to be multi-generational and include as broad a range of participants as possible. I wouldn't push the people who don't want to participate in that too much because it'll just kind of spoil the soup, if you will. Right. But collect the stories that everyone feels are most important and their reasons why. Mm-hmm. Then give that list with a little bit of direction. And I mean direction in terms of, please cover these topics. And by the way, here's how the cameras are going to work and here's how we're going to do it. And give those to the youngest members of the family, 5, 6, 15, 27. Let the younger people be the first storytellers.
And can I ask you, I love that, Mike, can I, just sorry to interrupt you, so what would be some basic questions to ask a youngster, one of the young generation, to get that process started? What would be a few questions that you're asking so they can reach into their filing cabinets, their storage compartments and start what I call vomiting?
Okay, all right. So what's a common family name? Not to name a client, but just a common family name everyone would understand besides Smith or Brown that we use here in the States.
What, Jones?
Jones. Okay, there we go. So Grandma, when did Jones become important to you? When did you learn that being a Jones was more than just being a person? A question like that will get them to dig in. And that's not a question that a 5-year-old would ask. But the beauty of having a 5-year-old ask it is that the elder will respond in very, very simple language. And it forces them to think back. What are the things that really made me proud of my family and my family name? And then you can go into, who did you look up to when you were a kid? And who do you look up to now? Great. Are the values the same or are they different? Mm-hmm. There have been a lot of changes in your life, Grandma Jones. Mm-hmm. What are some of the ones that you remember the most? And when was the family stressed or pressed against those ideals? And how did we respond as a family? Did your parents ever help you make a big decision using those same ideas? Did you fight back? Did you go along with it? What happened? So just that kind of
great questions. Love it.
Kind of question. Yeah.
I'm sure just those 5 or 6 that you've mentioned could really open up, a good half an hour conversation with someone. It'll be great.
Since we live in a digital world now too, Reg, it's really interesting to save those stories as shorter modules and to tag them using the little social media tags, and then to compare them. So these are the folks in this area of the world in the family that are doing something. Here's what this area believes. Here's what the males believe, the females believe. Here's what all the grandmothers said when they were 15. Here's what they said when they were 30. Here's what they said when they were 80. Over time, if you think about curating your assets like that, the stories can get mixed and matched by future editors and future storytellers. Now, you won't be in control of the narrative, But if you've got the family constitution, if you've got the guiding principles in the right place, and you keep telling stories off of that thread, this family, the familyness will be stronger and stronger over time, and it'll
Love
create
it,
a
love it.
tremendous sense of pride.
Valuable tips, Mike, and I'm going to go off in some other areas with the time that we've got with you. So if you're a chairman, MD, CEO, you're a business owner, and you've got to get visible in the marketplace, okay? You want to get on the platform these days virtually, but we'll be back in those conference rooms before we know it. And what tips would you give an owner who needs to use storytelling, the ability to share good stories to help them with their brand, to help them to get their message out, which could hopefully win them more customers, attract more talent? What are your thoughts around that area?
Yeah. Well, I guess it depends on if the leader is already a natural speaker and storyteller or not. If they are, it would be very natural for them to step into that role and start telling stories.
And if they're not,
well, hang on. If they are, it's also very important for them to start building more storytellers inside of the organization. That's the best thing a good storyteller can do, is model desired behavior for others, because everybody in the organization has story as a universal constant. It's kind of a glue that holds us all together and keeps us focused on our purpose or our purposes. So that's one. If you're not a good storyteller, it's kind of like, I read this story about this Indian guy who would put tablets inside of walls in India as like a way of training kids, and they taught themselves different languages, and they taught themselves math, and they became familiar with science. And he called it the grandmother effect. I wish I could remember his name. But basically, the kids come home, grandma's sitting there to take care of them, and she doesn't know anything about calculus. But she might say, okay, Sally, tell me a little bit about why that equation is the one you use instead of the one you told me about last week. And that gets Sally to start thinking in her head about what's going on. And she's telling grandma all this stuff. When you teach a story, you learn. That's the point. So by giving people storytelling assignments, a little bit of storytelling research, or find me the best storytellers, you're getting people engaged, and you're telling them with your behavior and by evidence of your words that stories are important. You're creating a kind of a new currency inside of the business that's not based on political power or oppression or profit. It's simply the joy of being human and of being connected with each other. Stories don't cost businesses anything, and they can give them an immeasurable return.
Love that. So I just want to add to that a little bit more. On your website, you've got an article with some of your team around 10 ways to make sure that your customers' experience and your brand are aligned. Now, we don't have time to go through all of that, but I just wanted, for the viewers, I want to go through the headings, and maybe if you could choose one or two of the 10 to expand on, it'd be great. So once again, it's all about linking customer experience with your brand and getting alignment. So one, make sure employees are engaged. Two, plan ahead for problems. Three, use the same colors. I found that one quite interesting. Four, make things easy. Five, under promise and over deliver. Six, keep your focus. Seven, add appealing signage. That's interesting. 8, poll your customers. 9, be authentic. And 10, show your personality. Which one do you fancy taking out of those and expanding on, Mike?
Well, you know, since I've always changed your questions in this interview, I'm not going to change it again, but I do want to say all of them are important. When people perceive an experience, they're not just picking up on one thing. When you go to a nice restaurant for dinner, you're not just judging how well the parking attendant takes care of your car. You're not just judging the greeting at the front door or the taste of the appetizer. You're judging everything. And that's why it's important to be a good orchestrator of all the details of your customer experience, because that is your brand. And your brand can't be any more valuable than what your customers experience. My two favorite ones, especially with a family business lens on it, are to make things easy for others and to be authentic. Making things easy for others means that you have to do the hard work for your business to work the way your customers want it to. There's so many software packages and so much rhetoric out there about ClickFunnels and marketing and automation. And as a customer, you don't like that. Nobody likes to watch ads in between their favorite show. advertising is a tax on brands that don't already make it or get it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that
We think,
makes total sense, Mike, because as you're mentioning it, I'm thinking of lots of clients we work with. If I take some of the senior members, they want simplicity.
mhm,
They want one step, two step, three steps done. And a
yeah,
lot of these things they get pitched with or approached with, or systems or processes, are so complex that, okay, even if they do say yes and start, they never end up implementing the full version of whatever it is.
exactly. And it's because these tools and products and services make people change the way they work. Our email is great. Just change the way you use your inbox. Our project management tools, our television is easy. Just program it with IFTTT, blah, blah, blah. You have to change so much. So what it turns out is that an experience is a great way to deliver value because it helps the company, the business, the people in it focus on what customers value the most. If they value time savings, if they value fewer steps, if they value better tastes and smells, just give them more of what they want and make it easy for them. The easier it can be for them, the more naturally they will work with you.
Love that,
And
yeah. So with the other one, the second one about being authentic, in your opinion, when you're sharing stories,
Mhm.
whether it's in a personal capacity, as a family, or whether in a corporate capacity, should you be a little bit vulnerable? Is it okay in your stories to show that you're not perfect and you make mistakes?
Yeah, that's a personal choice. My personal choice is to share enough about myself that people can relate to me not only as the face of a brand, but as a guy, a person who's been through some challenges, survived some, nailed some, really did great, and is still struggling with some as well. Because everybody's looking in story, whether it's through literature or movies or music, they're looking for examples of how to live better. So if you can be a really good model of your values and you can deliver what your brand promises and be human at the same time, you can't do any better than that.
That's great. So we're talking about your business, your company, and linking this for a second. And for those of you enjoying the content, don't forget to subscribe. Go to the description area to find out more about Mike's company. But one of the things, Mike, you do a lot of workshops. So you facilitate workshops under different themes. Like I
Mhm.
was looking at your website about journey mapping. I thought that was
Mhm.
interesting.
Yeah.
Digital transformation with a focus on the customer, being customer centric. And then this one I definitely want you to talk about, undercover customer. Okay,
Uh,
how does that workshop link with storytelling?
oh my gosh. Well, you have you seen in different parts of the world that you work in variations of undercover boss?
We've seen some of those online, but yeah, I don't think it's a
Okay, let me
big thing
explain
here.
what it
But
is.
there is that concept of mystery shopping, which companies would use.
Okay, so let me start with this. A few years ago, the introduction of my website had this quote on it. 86% of executives believe they deliver a great customer experience,
Mhm.
but only 8% of their customers agree. And that study was done by Bain in 2005. And it just shows the disconnect between what companies think they're doing that's valuable to their clients and what they're not. So one of the ways to close that gap is to actually go out in the field and see how the decisions you've made as a leader trickling through your people and your business systems and your in-store or your on-site or your in the field operations processes actually touch your customers. Most of us work in silos. We've got finance and accounting and marketing and field operations and trucks and security and all of that. But when it comes out to the touch point with a customer, they get one thing, they get one experience.
Right.
And most people don't coordinate around how that experience is going to be. And that's what an undercover shopper, regardless of the business, it doesn't have to be retail, it can be undercover patient, undercover passenger, undercover concrete buyer, anything. When you see the way your business treats customers, you go, oh my gosh, I had no idea.
Mm.
And it forces you to kind of close those gaps between what you feel and what you want and what your dad and your grandfather told you about running your business and what you're doing to customers. I'd like to bring out a really important linguistic difference to clients, and that there's a big difference between doing things for customers and doing things to customers. And oftentimes the operations do too much to them for the benefit of the business and not enough for them.
So once you've
one
got
last
that,
point.
so Mike, once you've got that intel, okay, you've got that information and it's real. This is how we're serving our customers right now. These are the flaws, these are the mistakes, these are the gaps. How do you then tie that into the story design experience with what you do?
Sure. Well, that is the beginning of the story thing. Reg, thanks for that just incredible question. When you come back with your findings, you'll see lots of things that don't look good and don't feel good, and you'll set off to making those right. Mm-hmm. So one of the fastest ways to figure that out is not to argue over whose idea is best or who has the best logic about which one we should pick. Mm-hmm. You create scenarios. We call them future stories. So you start off, if you'll give me an example, we can work with it live, but in general, you figure out a future story and you detail out all the steps to get to that final stage. Mm-hmm. You might have a second one or a third one. The trick is to do all three. Mm-hmm. You figure out how to make each of the ideas feasible without regard to all of the other constraints that are currently in place. And this is the hardest part, and this is the richest part of the interview for leaders and for the followers on the family teams.
Right.
Just because you have rules in place about the way things work today, the priorities, the money, the values, and you don't want to change your values. But just because you have those in place doesn't mean that you can't change them. If customers change their needs, you have to change the way your business works to meet them, period. There will be changes. No matter how hard you want something, doesn't mean you have the right to get that. And that's the hard news part. So the beautiful part of using stories is you can explore several different scenarios, work them all out to actually be possible, and then compare all the different trade-offs. One might be too costly, one might take too long, one might change the feeling of the brand. And I know we're talking kind of abstractly, we can bring it down to an example.
Not at all. I think I'm getting clarity, Mike, which is that your business and the concept of story mining, if I use the term ecosystem, you've got many touch points. We've talked briefly in this episode about whether it's a founder using it for a speech, whether it's sharing the stories with your own family and capturing those for the future as part of your constitutional charter. You've touched on how it links in with branding. You've touched on how you could be a mystery shopper or undercover customer and how that could link into then the future story. So what I'm understanding is that right at the core is to make sure that there's a powerful story, but really it could be linked into so many different areas of a company.
That's true, Reg, and it actually is. The way we run our companies is very complicated and very profitable and full of opportunities. But very few people that aren't in the C-suite or aren't on the leadership team have full purview of that. So stories help to bring out the details in all the different departments so that everyone has better visibility into how we deliver the great results that deliver a great experience, which creates word of mouth, and better profits. So stories are the kind of the glue that holds the whole place together.
So Mike, out of the 750 engagements that you've done, and you've worked with some really big brands, around the world, could you just share one case study where they had a significant problem? You went through the whole story design and experience with them, and then what happened at the end? And maybe you don't have to mention figures, but maybe they're a significant part of that $2 billion of improvement and equity value that you've created for a client.
Okay. How long do I have?
As long as you want. It depends if the viewers want to stick around for the next 12 hours.
All right, well, I'll start with the end and we'll work backwards. Kentucky-based privately held company. Kentucky is the state where the Kentucky Derby is run, the big horse race every year. They did a private sale for $300 million on exit. That was 5 years after working with Storyminers. When we started working with them, they were at about 1/10 of that revenue. So their first request for us was they were growing quickly already. They had a viable, profitable business model in the bill pay space. And they said, Mike, we want to keep our experience comfortable, while we double every year. Not easy.
Experience comfortable.
That was their guiding light to us. And that was the employee experience. They wanted their employees to feel connected, engaged. They needed an onboarding tool. They wanted a story for the future so that as they grew into a big business, they could keep their small business feel, which meant lots of personal attention, quick returns of the call, simplicity, not a very complicated organizational structure to navigate. So what we did is we helped them create a reason for being, very similar to what you have in the family charter. It's a statement about who they serve, the value they create, and what their clients could do with the value that they create to create more on their own. We did governing and guiding principles. We created a promise map, which shows specifically who owes what to whom in order to get the work of the customer done. Clayton Christensen.
What's called a promise map.
A promise map, and it shows like accounting owes the board accurate financials on a biweekly basis. The board owes the sales department, direction on whatever. So when everyone can see what the actual gives and takes are in an organization, they can see how it's truly wired, because an organizational chart only reflects communications down and reporting up. It doesn't show how work actually gets done. So to focus more on the work, you need a promise map. The cornerstone for this project was to develop an employee experience. So we detailed out what the pre-hire, the onboarding, and the first month were like in terms of the rituals, the clues that we would give people, etc. And that would help them attract talent from some of the top financial cities like Chicago, New York, and Boston to little Louisville, Kentucky. And that worked extremely well.
Love that. That's good. So I think that's a great story in summary. What's going on behind you, by the way? I'm curious about that board behind you.
Oh, this is an outline. I actually work here. So this is an outline of a book that I'm working on. And I think it will be called Story Mining, How the Organizations of the Future Will Be Built.
Oh, we look forward to reading that.
Stories.
So when's the deadline? When's the deadline for the draft?
It's going to be after we get our new website out, which I'm hoping will be this month. So it'll be this year.
Love that, Mike. So I think you left us with really good ideas, but I don't want to stop. One of the recent articles on your website, you talked about being responsible in the times of crisis, and for those of you, make sure that the link is in the description for everybody so you can read the article. But I like the way that you've taken big brands around the world and use them as anchors to give people a really good message. So maybe you could expand on that. For example, the first one that pops up is Netflix. And you're giving advice around how one sends emails to inform their subscribers. Could you expand on that, Mike?
Remind me about the Netflix one.
So you've basically got advice there about informing subscribers that, let's say, to take my own company, if we've got a monthly newsletter that goes out, or we're sending emails to all of our clients, in some cases you could be over communicating. In some cases, maybe the communication is not clear.
There was the Netflix and the other ones in that article were really, really powerful, which is why we put them there. Yeah. But there's one that's way better than all of those, and I'd like to introduce that if it's okay.
Go ahead. Yeah, please.
Okay. Airbnb's CEO had to send out some tough news, and if you look up, you can find it online very easily. Airbnb letter to employees. It'll pop right up at the top. So they had to reduce the size of their operation. They had to furlough some people. They had to change the way they operate. But it was done according to the company's values. And the values were actually brought up in the letter. There was a tremendous amount of respect that was shared for the folks. And several times the CEO mentioned that it's not because of you that you were let go. It's just because of the economics of the times right now. He went out of his way to care for employees, to care for customers, to double down on values. He also cut a number of pet projects because they weren't part of the company's core. So he used the values in the organization to hunker down, to stay very, very focused on that. And he took off a whole bunch of different parts very, very equally. It was also a very generous severance package. People got to keep their computers, their health care, They got services to help them find new employment. He encouraged communications between everyone and so on and so on. But with all the crazy things going on with COVID, that's one of the highlight examples in the last few weeks about how an experience, a story, and a profitable business can all happen at the same time.
Yeah, it's good. It's a good example. And talking about the crisis, Mike, and what's happening. What are your predictions for the future when it comes to businesses and your story, your message, your branding? What are some of the trends that you see coming up for the future?
So I think that people, customers and employees are going to be able to judge the brands that they choose to work with better than ever before, because they've been so pleased and so disappointed during this time by companies that keep their promises and don't, and by those that shift their relationships with respect and with good communications, and those that drop you or treat you as a number. That's coming up in a big way. The other thing I think that's going to happen is that because this is the first time in this generation's lifetime that we've all gone through the same thing at the same time, whether you're rich or poor, in a rural area or a big city, whether you're well educated or not, your life is at risk just like everyone else's. Your business is at risk just like everyone else's. And there's a big difference now between the responsible role that larger organizations can take and their connection to their customers. So I believe it's now more about we than me. And brands that make that part of the storytelling, that larger we with a capital W, are going to stand head and shoulders above. But customers can see through a lie better than they've ever been able to before. Transparency works two ways. You can't fake transparency. You either really are authentic with your brand or you're not. You just can't lie anymore. So the brands that do the hard work to take care of their employees, to treat their customers well, to make sure that their operations are geared to lift their customers and to deliver more value for them rather than to just take profit, are the ones that consumers are going to flock to and stick with. That's
who stands out for you globally that meets that criteria? Who do you respect? Who do you think they're going to win in the future because their DNA is already right today during the crisis?
There are so many brands that are standing out, and I'll give you some examples in a second, but the part that really is amazing for me is how many very small, minuscule brands are acting the right way on behalf of their communities, their values, etc. They just won't break their own rules, which is fascinating. Whether it's a little coffee or flower shop that won't open until it's safe, or the gym that I go to that says, we're not going to open until we see alignment between the federal, the state governments, and the Centers for Disease Control. When those three convene, then we'll take our direction. But until now, the doors are shut. Fascinating stuff. The brands that have done really well in the past continue to do well. One of the national quick service restaurant chains here, it might not be very well known overseas, called Chick-fil-A. They call themselves the inventors of the chicken sandwich, not the chicken. They've got a very strong moral basis in the way they operate. And they have been more profitable than any of their competitors during COVID. They've used it as an opportunity to introduce semi-pre-prepared meals through the drive-through. So you can pick up your lunch and you can take home 2 packages prepared at home and you've got dinner. So not only did they double or treble their drive-through sales, but they did it during a time of crisis. It's fascinating what they've done with gearing up delivery services and leaning on that one of their pillars of innovation and the other of hospitality.
Some good examples there. Got my brain popping. I'd like to get your opinion on something, Mike. When we're working with larger families, we encourage them, especially when you get to third generation, because it's not just about the parents. You're talking about children, siblings, and now you're talking cousins. And when everyone's getting married, you can end up with some of the families we've dealt with are like 50 members, active members in the business. But what we encourage them to do every year or every couple of years is to have a family retreat. A smaller version could be a family forum that happens maybe every 6 months to bring everyone together. So if you can imagine that, Mike, you've got, let's say 40, 50 people together for 2-3 days. And when it comes to stories, what type of exercises could they do to create more harmony and unity as a family? What do you think?
That's great. Well, let me blend that with something that I've seen work in the past. So we're going to tie two ideas together. Mm-hmm. Before they come together as a family, in my opinion, one thing to consider is to go on your own field trip and work inside the family business, or work at a competitor, or work in a market, or bring your camera with permission, of course, and start capturing things from your point of view. Use a professional editing team to kind of standardize those stories, not to take the energy out, but to make it so production values don't make one wildly more popular than another. And then talk about what they saw in the real world. One of the most insular things that happens with any group, be it families or corporate or nonprofit, is that they start to think that their thinking is the customer's thinking. So the biggest insights, the best opportunities always come from leaning in to what your customers are thinking and feeling and saying about you. So I'd encourage everyone to become a spy, not in a bad sense, but to go out and find the best, and then to bring that back and to have themed conversations about what we're doing versus what the world really needs. Starting that conversation about making the business more about customers and more about employees cannot lead down a bad path.
So that could be a little exercise everybody can do. And what about maybe next-gen members who may be too young to get that work experience? How could you maybe tie them into something creative to create more harmony, unity with stories, maybe for the younger generation that are that you can't employ?
Say again?
The ones that you can't employ right now.
So as long as they're able to talk, I would use whatever modality they're strongest in. If they like to draw, let them draw. If they like to paint, let them paint, play music, sing songs, or tell stories. But I think using them to capture those very innocent stories is key. And maybe with the help of a facilitator, someone like a gifted teacher, for example, who teaches gifted students, that person could ask them a series of questions that would point to the earliest family values that they've captured, because all kids are highly influenced during their youngest years by their parents, and those parents have been influenced by their parents, and the family thing is very strong, I imagine, in some cases. So having the kids say, what is the Jones family about? Paint a picture about that, tell a story about that. Maybe it just ends up, along the wall as people are having a meal together and gets lightly touched on. Maybe it's something a little bit more striking and the conversation leans into that. And what would you like to be when you become a senior Jones? Those kinds of questions. You'll be surprised at how young in age people start to develop preferences and opinions. So just like we lean into customers, leaning into those younger family members without expectation of what they're going to say and without trying to control what they say can surface some amazingly interesting new topics to talk about. And since they come from the family, they're worthy of exploration, I mean.
Got it.
And that's the key thing. When you show with your behavior that you're willing to lean in and listen to someone else's opinion, that behavior spreads throughout the organization. It creates greater harmony, more open, etc.
Yeah, it's good. I like it. So, Mike, when it comes to family board meetings, business board meetings, which are meant to be serious, like you mentioned earlier, graphs, charts, numbers, is that a good place to bring in stories or not? Or is it too soft for people in the room to go, look, just give us the facts. We don't need stories. I'm sure you've heard that line, give us the facts. We don't need stories.
If context is not in question, if it's just an operations meeting and you're comparing this month with last month, you probably don't need a lot of story and it might slow you down. On the other hand, businesses are always part of a larger context. Family is the larger context. That constitution is the larger context. You don't just want to make profits, you want to make good profits. Good profits as defined by the values and the operation modality, if you will, of the business. So stories can help bring color to numbers. An example of that would be several of the TED Talks that have used dynamic graphics to explain what big shifts mean. Hans Rosling, who I forgot the name of his book. Hans Rosling did a fabulous TED Talk where he explained some population and healthcare and economic shifts. You can find it on YouTube. Information is Beautiful does a great job of bringing out the beauty in data storytelling. Narrative Science is another company that converts huge amounts of information into absolutely beautiful and easy to understand stories. Dakota, Decooda in Atlanta, Georgia, does something very, very similar, as does Mather Economics. So there are lots of firms out there that are starting to turn data into stories. Why? Because we understand stories better than we understand numbers. We all think we understand numbers the same way, but they mean different things to different people because they're only inputs to larger decisions. The only thing that we let numbers make decisions on is how much rocket fuel to inject into the jet engine as the rocket takes off. That's calculated.
Yeah, it's good. Nice.
Decisions, it's all about your humanity. That trumps at the end of the day.
Last question I've got for you is, you've traveled the world, and my understanding is that there was a part of your life where you decided to go abroad for a number of years, and you picked up a few languages. Is that right?
I did. I was an exchange student, unlike most Americans. I lived in Brazil and the former Soviet Union. So I speak Portuguese, some Spanish, and a little Russian. My Russian's a little bit rusty, but my Portuguese is pretty good.
That's pretty good. Well, I wish you all the best, Mike. And again, for those of you watching this, want to know more about using Mike's expertise, as a consultant, as a facilitator, as a speaker, maybe at a conference or a family meeting that you've got coming up, go to the description, find out more, go to his website, and all the details are there. Mike, I really want to thank you for taking some time out and being with us today. And I'm sure that we've left all the viewers with some ideas, some insights, some words of wisdom. And don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, share the video, and leave some comments. So on that note, Mike, I want to thank you very much once again, and look forward to catching up again soon.
Thank you, Reg. Take care.
Bye-bye.